How does it feel to be well, not a new author, but to release a new book?
Oh, it feels good. It's been a long time coming. It was a long project. Yeah, long gestation project, but it feels good to finally have it out. I guess I've only been thinking about it some. It was you finish books, you work on them, and then they're done years before, and then you're getting them. The whole publishing process takes a long time, but it
Mm.
feels really good to have out there now. I mean,
Yeah.
I put a lot of work into it, and at least it can do whatever it will do now. Now it's its own thing. I can
Yeah,
just
man. It's exciting. I wish I could hold it up. I've got my copy ordered and it's on the way, so
Oh,
I'll
thanks.
have to show it.
I didn't bring a copy over, so I don't have one here.
Don't worry, I'll edit one kind of into the frame and all that. But I wanted to ask you, so, what is the purpose or what's the problem that the book is trying to solve? What are you working with the book?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I'll put it this way. So, I went to graduate school and did a doctoral degree in, I think technically it's called Theological and Philosophical Studies in Religion
Hmm.
at Drew University, and had a great group of professors there. Worked with a few professors at Union Theological Seminary as well, some of whom were on my dissertation committee, John Tatominal. And when it came time to do a dissertation, I had a kind of very particular idea about it. And I proposed a kind of what would ultimately be a book, but a kind of from an interspiritual perspective, and looked at even the nature of reality and metaphysics from different traditions, as well as the spiritual path and in inquiry, communities of inquiry, both in academia and on the spiritual path. So I put together a whole proposal and took it to my dissertation committee. And in the committee, they asked some really good questions. They thought it would be a really interesting project. They were interested in it. They wanted to see it. But there was a question of one, where does this belong? What genre is it? Kind of in
Hmm.
two ways. One, is it even a dissertation? Because it was
Hmm.
much more a book. But second, like, what's the field? Where does this belong? Um, and so I thought that was a really interesting question, and I had to go back and think about it to try and answer it. And it ended up leading me down a whole line of thought. I certainly thought it was an interesting project. But then I had to think, okay, so then does it make sense um, in a university setting or in academia? And it made me realize that there may be stuff that I like to do because I find it personally interesting and think some others might be interested. But does that mean it belongs in our university system or in the academy? And so it led me into that question. But then I couldn't answer that question ultimately unless you have a sense of what the university is, what's the purpose of the academy. And you can't answer that question unless you're taking into account the larger context of the society we live in, which in our case is a democracy, and in particular, a very increasingly religiously pluralistic democracy. And so it made me then consider all of these other questions. And I ended up coming back to think, no, yes, I do think that this would be a wonderful project, that it does belong in the universities and the academy. But I had to make an argument for that now. And so the book really became that argument.
I see. And fascinating. Yeah, I mean, one of the arguments I saw you put in there was kind of that you believe that society as at large, but also the universities need more contemplative spaces, and spaces to kind of be able to have spiritual conversation in that kind of way. Is that what you mean?
I do. I absolutely do. Because personally, I find my experience shows me that I think spiritual life, contemplative depth, growing into being more loving, compassionate, and wise human beings. That first, it's possible.
Hmm.
And second, it's probably the only way to create the kind of world we'd like to see.
Yeah.
And so I think it's very important in our educational system. And that's part of the arguments of the book, but there's a larger argument going on that also wants to say that recognize that as a personal perspective of mine
Hmm.
and perspective that other people share, but not necessarily what everyone has to agree to.
Sure.
So within a democracy, we have, especially a huge democracy like ours, that is the most pluralistic, diverse democracy on the planet.
Mhm.
Lots of ethnicities, races, cultures, lots of different religious traditions. Um, there's a lot of different ideas about what would be best, and there's also a lot of very secular viewpoints.
Mm.
So, and overall, the argument was, really saying that in order to have a vibrant democracy, we need to be able to have space for diverse perspectives on the nature of reality,
Right.
and that this is a decolonial practice, a very important decolonial practice, and it's essential to the health of our democracy. Otherwise, what happens is we tend to interpret very secularized perspectives, which have very particular ideas about the nature of reality, but they become hegemonic or dominant in our culture and in the academy, and they leave out the vast majority of people who don't hold to hard secular positions, yet we unknowingly and unassumingly adopt those positions
Mhm.
because it's the discourse that's out there, especially around issues, say, of justice. And a lot of the hot issues that are out there today, they're all flowing from very secularized viewpoints of
Mm.
authors who make very good points, I think. Judith Butler, Michel
Mhm.
Foucault, Jacques Derrida, but almost
Mm.
no one is understanding that at a very fundamental basis, they are assuming and starting with a hardcore secular perspective where
Mm.
social construction is the only thing that's real.
Mm.
Nothing else exists. So there's no depth to reality. There's no deeper levels of love or compassion or wisdom. Things like opening the heart and learning to unwind some of our cultural conditioning. These things aren't really present because there's no other perspectives present. And so we call them secular, but to me, they're really religious perspectives. They
Sure.
are views of the nature of reality. They give you practices based on those views of the nature of reality. They're
Mm.
very moral and ethical. They're explicitly trying to make a better world. They're trying to, I won't say indoctrinate, but a lot of people are trying to indoctrinate you into their way of thinking and their thoughts because they think it's morally better, and you're
Mm.
a bad person if you don't do it. This is
Mm.
very, very religious. And so
Right.
and that's fine to me. But when you try to make it hegemonic or the only perspective that's valid and you don't allow any other perspectives there, to
Mm.
me, it becomes religious fundamentalism. So a lot of what passes for a secular university today, at least in the humanities, is
Mm.
really a religious fundamentalism that refuses to allow diverse perspectives.
Mm.
Ironically, often in the name of diversity, but there's usually not a lot of diverse perspectives actually allowed in those
Oh,
conversations.
so right. Yeah, I definitely feel that being in university right now. Um, and that's kind of an interesting thing that I think we're seeing also with online discourse. And, um, it's almost the more that turns up, the more the divide between like a political divide, really kind of takes place. The hegemony that you're talking about, the one wayness. It seems like political parties grab up everything that they can in those worldviews and make every issue a political issue. And then next thing you know, you can't have a conversation outside politics. And the postmodern worldview is just that. It's just that's what you were mentioning, where it's almost like this social construction. That's the only thing that really exists. And speaking of metaphysics or anything like that is like a transpersonal human experience is almost too subjective, too uneasily explained. And we're just going to chalk it up to random firings in the brain or chemical reaction in the brain or your eyes just seeing things or your heart just feeling things, whatever. There's this reductionistic element that leaves no room for these contemplative spaces, right? That like has almost like squeezed them out.
leaves no room for them, and I think leaves out the majority of the people in the country. I mean, when we look at our country and look at surveys, over 90% of people have some sort of spiritual worldview, some sense of something greater than ourselves, whether they call that God or spirit or an awakened mind. It turns out a lot of people that aren't religious, this is the whole rise of the spiritual but not religious, or the nuns,
Mm,
NONES, they
mhm.
still, most of them hold spiritual views of the world.
Sure.
So you're
Sure.
actually leaving out what most people um, hold to as being part of the conversation.
Mm,
And second, and this is the insidious part, what you're actually do is forcing everyone into a very particular religious persuasion,
yeah.
which is that the only thing that exists is social construction. Now, most people don't understand this because then there's a whole, a whole ladder list of things that follow once you take up that stance that might make a lot of sense. If the only thing that exists is social construction, then coming up with new social constructions that you think are better and forcing as many people as possible to adopt them is actually the only way you can change the world.
Right. Right.
So you can understand the kind of hard stance sometimes people take, but I think most people are doing this without realizing that they're making these assumptions in the first place. They
Yeah.
just, it's the right thing to do, basically.
Yeah, I think there's that, and there's also the assumption that, well, there's kind of an a priori that religion is bad, spirituality is hijacked. When you start talking about these things, you get discreditable in the Western view, and so there's almost, just a general avoidance of touching that type of conversation out of fear of not being taken seriously because of the religion at the time.
Yes. Yeah.
And
And, I think part of the consequence of the way we've set up such a hard sacred secular binary, which is
mm,
the title of the book, right? The sacred secular binary. Um, is recognizing one, this binary emerged. We can understand it, but through the West, the history of Western culture, and particularly in the United States, one of the first kind of democracies that ever happened. Um, it's all about a long struggle with overarching Christian authority, which was the history of the West, right? And we see the struggle in science, and we see it as we start to form universities. And it all kind of happened where everyone assumed Christian superiority, even when we made a sacred secular binary. Uh, Everyone still, I mean, the Supreme Court up till the 1900s, you get court cases and they're quoting the Bible and they're saying
sure.
explicitly this is a Christian country and these are the values. So even though it was a democracy, it was assumed that Christians were superior, as well as, of course, men and white people. Um,
Mhm,
and so it came out of I think it was a good development, but the truth is we no longer live in Christendom. We don't live with an overarching Christian authority. We live amongst a lot of diversity, a lot of religious pluralism. And so if you were starting today to think about how you would set up a society, especially the university system, our professional educators and thinkers in society, where would you set up a sacred secular binary? And so that's kind of what I'm looking at a lot in the book. Of course, you don't want people evangelizing in the classrooms, particular religious persuasions. So there's something to be said about a binary, especially in state universities. But it doesn't make any sense to say you have to adopt a position that only social construction is real to even participate in the university system. That's not a
yeah.
good guiding line for our
n-
society, I don't think.
No, and it's scary. It's actually, in my opinion, kind of a scary position. It almost reminds me of like a Brave New World controller kind of attitude, right?
Yes.
Um, and you know, to think of the complete divorce of religion and law is important because if you think about just the the underlying structure of our law saying that everybody has the potential to uh, redeem themselves, right? This is why we even have prisons in the first place and we give out sentences because, we understand that this person has the potential to turn another cheek, not be in, doing these acts and do something that's more productive to not just themselves, but society. And so having that underlying recognition of the potential for change for people. You know, do you see that kind of sliding away? Do you think that's something that's threatened to leave?
Absolutely. I think that is a really important point, Austin. And I think we can see it in a few different areas. I think the law is a great one. And even as you're saying, it's, and when we think of people being rehabilitated in some way or changing or, traditionally the way it was set up, and this is because, mostly because it was within a Christian dispensation. So everybody has a divine imprint. They can be changed. People can be saved. But, we don't, if someone has actually committed, some bad crime and they need to go to jail for a certain amount of time, there's, of course, a lot of problems with the prison system. Um, but can there be a transformation that happens? I think, the way you and I would think about it, and a lot of people, there's a certain transformation of the heart. It's not a transformation of learning the right language, the right talking points, the right things to say, and now you're going to be better in society. In other words, learning new social constructions that are going to change you, but actually being changed in the depths of who you are and your beingness in the world. And that, of course, our jail and prison system, they do not do a good job of that. But the idea that it's possible and can happen, I think it's it's getting lost. And you don't only see it there, but, perhaps the biggest place that this has become the biggest problem is the economy and the economic system and the runaway capitalism that basically worships profit and wealth. And, this was not the case in the past as much when you had a more religious worldview, even if it was very homogenous and had its own issues, you had some moral checks on economic wealth. And if you were wealthy, you were expected then to play a role in giving back to society, holding positions, serving others. I mean, that's actually how judges came about. Originally, it was people who were wealthy and playing this role in society. Um, but once you disconnect an economic system from any sense of moral or ethical values, except for what you can get away with by the law, you end up with a completely exploitative, immoral, religious system that we call the economy.
Yeah.
There's some very interesting theorists like John Tatomanol who thinks that actually the greatest religious indoctrination of our times and perhaps of any time in human history is actually the way we're disciplined by our economic system. That it
Hmm.
is it's doing religious work. It's giving us a particular way of looking at the world in self-interest, and you act in your self-interest and you bargain in your self-interest and you make as much money as you can, and this is and that's what's moral, that's what's ethical, that's what drives us forward. And we
Right.
all tend to kind of think that way because we're disciplined into that view of the world and its particular practices that it tells us to perform.
For sure. Yeah, and the way that marketing will steer the view of everything that's going on, just to make sure that um, what seems like, for instance, I always think about this with Nike, right? Where it's like they throw a bunch of marketing dollars at the top athletes, and like make it seem like they are, and they are an athletic brand focused on the best of athletes and putting money into these, young and up and coming athletes and existing career athletes. But they're also making a lot of their stuff over in, sweatshops basically, or like borderline slave labor that goes on in China and Vietnam, and other countries. And it's like, we are just fine to look the other way. We're fine to let LeBron James cash the check. We're fine to kind of like wear that brand ourselves on our feet, on our, our sweatshirt. And it's like the runaway capitalism, I totally agree with. And it's so artistic the way that, I guess in a Baudrillard sense, that hyperreal is kind of hiding and revealing certain things that it wants you to kind of stay in order to kind of keep like a worldview. right? Like there's many companies like this. And if we look at like McDonald's is another one that also sponsors athletes, has this kind of fund with hospitals and like cancer divisions and act like they're kind of giving back when heart disease is like the number one killer in our whole country. And a lot of the stuff that goes in the McDonald's food attributes to that, you know, and it's just kind of, it's interesting the way you can kind of brush up an image and you actually can put a dress on a pig and sell it here in America. You know,
Yeah, we love to buy them.
we love to buy them. We love to buy them and not think twice about it, you know, and we get actually upset if people unearth things about, you know, the things that we like, you know,
Yeah,
and it can feel hopeless. You know, I had this situation where I was on the phone with my grandmother one day and she was in a Wendy's drive through. And, you know, I was just kind of thinking of everything that was like the structure in order for us to have that conversation, right? It was like, one, the slave labor that went into mining the batteries for our cell phones so that we could be on the phone, right? And then not to mention like where the chips come from and, you know, the companies that then are providing the service for us that we don't own actually any of our phone calls. The phone conversation I was having actually belonged to the carrier that was between my grandmother and I. So we didn't even own what was between us. Then to mention she's pulling fast food from a drive-through window and everything that's involved with like, you know, the factory farming and like the production of that food for these minimum wage workers that can't, you know, buy a house or even have a hope of owning property. And then into her car, which is like a Toyota, which is, you know, a lot of parts made in America, some made other places, but the fuel in the car also kind of can come from questionable places. And it's like,
yeah,
that's not even touching the clothes that were on her back at the time. It's like every element of the structure of that conversation was almost like on the back of poor people or of poorer countries that we can get products cheaper at, and no one cares, you know?
yeah. And people there, you're almost forced to do products in these other countries because of the way the economic system is set up, or you can't compete. And I think, you know, it makes me think one thing for today. I think a lot of people, and at least I've seen this with a lot of younger people, you can look at it and look at these systems, right, that you just named so well and talked about a couple of them and how entangled we are in them, and how almost basically impossible it is to get out of those. We can do it to some degree, but so I think another big danger is then to feel depressed and to feel helpless and to feel like there's nothing we can do.
Right.
And I think that is a very self defeating and self prophesizing attitude to take. And so it's really helpful to recognize that stuff, but then recognize that it doesn't mean that things are hopeless, which is the kind of circle you can get them when there's just social constructivism. This is classic Michel Foucault. All we have is micro resistances. We can't really do anything to
Right.
change the bigger, and it's all about these systems, right? But I really want to plant a flag to say that's not true. There is a lot of good we can do in the world, and you have to be able to find that moral stance within yourself, um, and do some good in the world.
Right.
So, you know, and I think one of the ways people can do that is by pursuing a contemplative or spiritual path with a lot of commitment, because ultimately, me personally, I believe that's the only change that's really going to shift things. Otherwise, you still have the human condition acting like the human condition, like it always has. And these are the kinds of things it does. It acts in self interest unless it's transformed. And then, you know, in terms of the book, is to establish some wider and broader conversations, especially with spiritual depth in our university systems, and because that just reflects where we are as a population, and it doesn't force us to assume a kind of a certain worldview that can become quite depressing quickly and kind of boxes us in, where sort of the only modes of resistance we have are, you know, getting really angry and a lot of opposition, and trying to change systems that are very, very difficult to change, and feeling helpless and depressed, when it may, you know, it may be it may turn out that it's not true, that only social construction is real, and
Yeah.
that we do have deeper resources at our disposal, to create a much better society with that we're ignoring because we don't allow room or even the perspective that there could be other things to
Mm,
use into the conversation. So we have
mm,
these very hegemonic, homogenous conversations about diversity and how to bring that about without really having actual diversity and diverse opinions in it. Um, and I think, there's a big question whether the kind of country and democracy we have with all of this diversity can actually hold without a sacred center.
right.
If the center's just nothingness or just a kind of flat land with no depth dimension, which is the overriding philosophy and view of the academy in the
Yeah.
humanities,
Yeah.
um, there's a real question whether it can actually hold together. Can we hold together without a sacred center?
Yeah.
I don't know if it's possible.
It doesn't look good.
It doesn't look good right now, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. And watching it erode around, like without that center, that, that doesn't just keep it like as a sticky hole, as something to collect around, but also is what informs every action moving outward, right? So it's like
yes,
that's what indicates the chaos, right?
yeah,
It's really something, yeah, that I'm being reminded of this. It was a study that I just learned about recently, and you've probably heard about it actually. It was a study done in the 70s. I wish I could remember the man's name, but he created this like rat utopia, and I think it was called Society 25 or something like that. The study basically consisted of that he had four pairs of rats, so it was eight rats total, right? And it was this utopia in the sense where it was this huge cylinder. There was like all these things that the rats could go and climb on and get into. There was endless food and water and supply, anything they needed, it was like utopia realized. The only problem was constraint, like space constraint, right? And so in 600 days, the rats went from utopia to borderline extinction. And the reason why it happened is because, of course, everything was fine. Rats started populating. Overpopulation took place. There was no room really left in the situation. And what happened was the rats started getting crazy. They started, getting violent, tearing each other up. They started adopting weird like sexual behaviors. They started not reproducing or being fertile anymore, even. And so this kind of physical space constraint ended up changing their psychology to the sense of going nuts, right? And what's interesting when we're kind of talking about these systems, like the secular system of like social construction, what's interesting is every single thing to a person is getting served on a plate, right? It's like,
yes,
oh, what gender are you? Here's everything you can pick from. That's real. What aesthetic do you choose? It's like, here's your starter kits for every little what stereotype you want to embody. And even if you think you're an individual, you're still shopping at brands that people think they're an individual at. And that's how you kind of show the world or show America that you're an individual is through brands. It's not even really through your own, you know, expression. Very little like authentic expression really exists in that way.
yeah,
And so my point with like the rats and like the way that the society is structured, and especially whenever everything's right in front of our face and accessible through social media on like the leash that is our cell phone that's constantly in our pocket, I think it makes us feel like there's way less free space. It makes us feel like there's way less options to explore as human beings because everything's prepackaged, everything's been explored, and with media, this is just kind of another Baudrillard point, is that, he said that, if you could go back in time and see a dinosaur, you'd probably be disappointed because it wasn't like Jurassic Park, right? It's like we already saw the huge T Rex and like, it chomping down and crushing the trees and like making the floor vibrate and everything. And if we went back and didn't have that experience, it'd be like, oh, Steven Spielberg did it better, right? And so we have this sort of like, it's already been done. Now I just consume all of these things because it's been, curated to the best of any experience I could come up with on my own. And therefore I have to select from these things rather than explore,
yeah. I think that's true, and I think I think social media plays a big role, makes us feel confined in a way that you might not expect it, because
Right.
it seems like there's this whole universe. We have the internet, you have all these things you can tune into. But in actual practice, when you're on social media, the experience of it tends to be, for a lot of people, it's almost like a world that can close in on you so quickly. So you
Right.
have to be so worried about what you're saying at times. And it's so much about this image or about this or about somebody paying attention. And it's so many short little conversations about anything important that very quickly spirals into negative emotions, that it feels like this very closed world. And so I think, one of the really important practices for people today, because we also live in environments sometimes, cities, other environments, is to find a way to unplug and get away to some spaciousness, however you need to do that. Find a park in a city, put the phone down, get outside, just stare up at the sky,
Mm.
find ways to bring a sense of spaciousness and calm and peace into our lives. It may be one of the most important things we can do to combat the sense of chaos and negativity, um, that we experience in the world today. I think we're generally unaware how much we contribute even to the negative influences that we are opposed to, simply through our own negativity and energies, even of resistance and opposition at times. Some of these people, like our president, Donald Trump, is an absolute master, a master, like of the highest level, of taking negative energy on, repurposing it, and just putting it right back out there and using it. It's literally like charging up his battery.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
so I think the more there's a place for opposition, it needs to happen, and
Mm.
resistance. I'm not saying that. But if we get stuck in that mode, if that's our overarching mode, if that's our way of viewing the world and interacting with it and interacting with people, we may be, without knowing it, contributing to these negativities just by putting that energy out there. And one of the best things we can do as a collective is just say no, just withdraw ourselves from that process,
Right.
learn to interact with it without it stirring our own negative energies, and bringing a sense of spaciousness and peace into our lives and into the work we do, because it's literally taking that energy out of the environment. And then there's less of it for these bad actors to harness and use against us.
Right. Yeah, that's a great way to put that. The less that you're having that you're aiming your attention at these things, the less you are empowering those ideas as an
Yes.
individual.
Yes. And engaging in the opposition and resistance in smart, efficient, and very conscious ways.
Mm.
So it does not become your way of life,
Mm.
how what you're feeling. It's you do it, and then you are doing opposition, a much greater opposition, at least certainly from the teachings of contemplative traditions,
Mm.
um, by bringing love, compassion. You don't destroy anger with anger. You don't beat violence with violence. You don't beat hegemonic systems by implementing your own hegemonic system.
Right.
You do it by creating a different world and different energy in the world.
Right. And I think that's really the radical shift, is stepping out of that game, that eye for an eye game that is so tempting to so many people, because I think of the exact thing you just mentioned is you recognize the way that the people that you're opposed to have acted, and the more heinous the action, the more justified you are to perform even a little more heinous of an action, right? It's like that idea where it's like, if you show up to a fight, I'll bring a bat. If you bring a bat, I'll bring a knife. If you bring a knife, I'll bring a gun, whatever. And it's like always upping the thing until we're now like, aiming the nuclear warheads at each other, you know? Um,
Yeah.
yeah.
And I think if you pay attention, if you really pay attention to your own life and how it actually operates, so much of the time, not every time, but so much of the time, we try to fight fire with fire, let's say, But we aren't able to really train our fire on the quote unquote opposition that's out there. And so what we do is we adopt a certain mode of being in the world that makes us look like we're doing something and that we're fired up. But who ends up receiving on the other end of our negativity? It's usually the people around us.
Yeah,
Because we
most of the
can't
time.
get to a Donald Trump, we can't get to these, the white
Right.
nationalists or racists. So we find someone around us who maybe doesn't agree with us quite as much, and we train our ire on them.
Right.
And we kind of have to keep finding people something to train it on, and this becomes a very destructive um, circle.
Yeah, people don't know how to locate the enemy. They just, they're like, I hate this idea. I hate that it's in place, whether it's a law or a social construct or some sort of thing that our society does. And I just hate that. And then anybody that participates in it is just as guilty as the creator. Anybody that's inadvertently living in it is also just as guilty. And then you just end up like creating all these walls, all these enemies around you, and people that would probably be your ally.
And
Yeah.
you can, even at the extreme ends, you don't put it in these words, but it's in the actions and emotions that you experience. You tend to act as if somebody else doesn't hold my very particular perspectives and ways of looking at the world, then they are the enemy. They are the
Right.
opposition. And so it
Right.
becomes this, like, to force everyone to think and say the same thing becomes the only, it's the only little bit of power we can find to try and do something quote unquote good in the world. But there's a big question whether we're actually doing good in the world. And it's an even bigger question whether we're actually changing anything in the world in a positive way. And
Yeah.
our own personal lives start to become, I mean, this has been my experience. What I've seen, people become depressed, they become angry, they become cynical. And so, and then they can even glorify the anger and the cynicism, and the depression is the only valid way of being in the world,
Yeah.
because you're sort of stuck with everyone agreeing with me or me feeling oppressed and triggered and threatened. And
Right.
it's not going to, everyone is not going to agree with us no matter who we are, where we go.
No, I know, and it's
And
so
we don't want
interesting.
them to. We want diversity.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think yeah. I mean, it's interesting because I get this bolder worldview, and I feel it all the time, and I feel like kind of constantly crashing up against the worldview, and what I'm trying to deduce to reality, and man, that kind of crashing into the justification for the like almost totalitarianistic rhetoric of like acknowledge everything I believe, or you are, whatever ist I want to call you.
Yeah.
And that's a really toxic thing to just be around. And also, it's just like putting down a lot of landmines for good people to step on. It's
Yes.
really most of it is really not about like it seems like the goalpost for if you can call it a goalpost, but say the litmus test for what is a hateful person or an actual ist, right? Like somebody that hates other races just for the fact that they're other races was a racist whenever I was growing up. And now it's just kind of like, oh, you inadvertently said something that's somehow tied to some colonial outlook. And because you used that expression accident, not even like on purpose, that means that you're inherently racist. And since that's the water we're swimming in, you actually can't not be racist.
Yeah.
And therefore, every interaction we have, I'm going to have that distance with you, that limit with you. You know.
And it's a very self-defeating attitude. There's a lot of, I mean, it's like, it's kind, it's what we're saying. Everyone else either believes exactly what I believe and says what I say, and I can't really be in conversation with anyone who has a different perspective, because as soon as they do, they are just a racist, a colonial, a white man, and so what ends up happening is it becomes very difficult to build any kind of healthy collaborative constituencies, which is the
Mm-hmm.
only way you get anything done politically. So you have a very hard time working in larger collaborative work. And what I think you experience, and I would challenge people to look at this in their own lives, you just experience a lot of continual fracturing,
Yeah.
fracturing, or conformity, and then fracturing. And
Mm.
somewhere here is being missed the depth of each person, the unique insights and gifts each person brings into this world to help it make a better place, how we support people to actualize those gifts and to grow deeper into who they are,
Mm.
um, and to respect opinions that are different from ours. Like,
Yeah.
deeply respect them, even when we think that they're very wrong.
Right.
To try and understand other people's perspectives and where they're coming from, to not judge them out of hand for something that they're saying. And when we judge them that way, we're just putting them in this box. You are this. And we're
Right.
trying to put everyone in boxes, and I just think it's not super helpful. So, one of the things I try to do in the book as well, the second half of the book is called Contemplative Democracy,
Mm.
but is to look at other ways of approaching these issues. So, how do you go about decolonial work from a contemplative perspective?
Mm.
And for this, I use Howard Thurman and Gloria Anzaldúa as two great examples of people who are clearly doing deep decolonial, democratic work. They believe in a vibrant, diverse democracy, but from a contemplative perspective that is really about transformation. And so, what does that mean? And what does our democracy look like? From the perspective of people who have been oppressed, but still hold a kind of contemplative and spiritual depth. And I do that. There's a whole chapter on democracy, and it's almost all African American voices, but people like Martin Luther King Jr. and James Baldwin and Malcolm X and Barbara Holmes and Vincent Harding and Cornel West and Eddie Glady Jr. and all of these theorists have ways of approaching democratic becoming and decolonial work that recognizes a depth of humanity, a possibility for spiritual transformation. In fact, those are essential to the process of building a better democracy.
Mm.
And so is imaginary visioning, radical futures, which I know is a lot of your interest, is huge in building a better democracy because it doesn't exist. So we have to dream it. So the
Right.
dreams and the hope and the working together and respecting people, and we don't all have to agree on all the same things, and certainly we shouldn't all be talking in the same way, because then we're clearly not being ourselves and we're losing our diversity.
Mm.
How do we build those kinds of collaborative constituencies for real political movement?
Right.
Because I think clearly what we're doing now, it doesn't work. It doesn't work in creating a better world. It doesn't work in keeping out the worst of an opposition that could get in there. And it doesn't work on our own side, that just
Yeah.
continually fractures and can't actually build healthy, sustainable communities across diversity itself.
Right.
And so we need we at least need more approaches,
Right.
a lot of different approaches to see what different ways can really be fruitful and help us.
Well, let me ask you this: what comes first? There is it having the diversity of opinions in a social constructionist country, or is it trying to get at the social construction a priori structure and change that to a more contemplative place, and then incorporate the diverse? Because the only reason why I bring this up is because if we keep throwing people that, like, say, we appreciate as like a politician or somebody that could really make real change into the system that exists right now, it seems like that just kind of gets ground up and back into the homogeny.
Yes.
Um, and so that can also lead to that like helpless feeling. And I really appreciate you mentioning what you want people to walk away from if they listen to this is, the personal responsibility that you have to, and the personal ability that you actually have to kind of pursue these sort of things on your own, which you might feel like you don't, some people might feel like they're not able to do. But I'm kind of curious, like, Yeah, how do you imagine that? How do you imagine the change actually being implemented? Yeah, how do you kind of see that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And just to hark on the personal responsibility one for a second
Yeah,
too,
yeah, yeah,
is
yeah.
that, I mean, I encourage everyone to just really let this settle in deeply. We can all become more loving, more compassionate, and more wise human beings. And that is what will ultimately lead to quote unquote justice. Not forcing everyone to think the same way or say the same things or institute laws. These are all important things, not getting everyone to think the same way, but
Right.
they have their place. But when you find, if you're feeling like you just can't affect this bigger structure no matter what, you can definitely become a more loving and compassionate person. And that's the hardest work you'll ever do in
Hmm.
this life. It's harder than changing the bigger social things. It is, if you actually try. And that's where contemplative traditions can be so helpful, because we have thousands of years of experiments in practices and techniques and ways of viewing the world and ultimately experiencing the world, that help us become more loving, compassionate, and wise. So there's a lot of resources there. Um, Now, on where do we get started? I think so. Beyond the personal, that just kind of that little personal responsibility footnote I'm putting in there, or title maybe. Um, so in my book, I think getting some things into the educational system, because I think you're right. Someone that just goes out there today is more likely to get eaten up. And then so that means we need to kind of take a step back and reassess what we're doing and begin to start some different projects. So those can look differently. You can try to create something in the world that just partakes of these qualities, but maybe is not politically directed. But if we're talking about a bigger political scene, I think the educational system is huge.
Yeah.
I mean, when we look at the discourse today, that I think, again, has really important points, very necessary insights, but very insufficient insights, necessary but not sufficient. Um, they come straight out of academia from 20, 30 years ago. And so there's this I believe, this isn't, I don't talk about this in the book, but that there is an outlier force in academia that greatly affects culture. And a lot of our culture is moved by what becomes popular in academia and the reactions against it. And I think if you go back and look, you'll almost see a 20, 30-year lag. And then other generations coming up, usually that skew, though, if you look at them more to the left, they will begin repeating the discourse in words that was in academia 20, 30 years ago as if it's their own thoughts,
Hmm.
if they just grew up thinking it. It's like
Hmm.
I think there's almost something ontological going on. It creates like a deep well of thought, and then it almost just popping into other people's brains. So
Hmm.
I think if you can get a substantive conversation going in the academy, in the university system, where we're basically thinking together and educating together as a culture. Uh, some of these questions actually from more diverse perspectives, especially some that have a real spiritual center, or I don't want to just say moral or ethical, because all the same secular people will say, but it's very moral and ethical what they're doing, which it is. There's just no depth dimension.
Right.
And I think that's why you see the continual fracturing, because there actually isn't something that can hold it together other than conformity.
Right.
And so what holds something together, if it's not a conformity of thought, it's a depth of being, it's a depth of heartfulness, it's
Right.
an empathy, a compassion, a transformation of the human condition to be able to embrace more diversity. It's a change of heart, metanoia. And so if we can get some conversations like this, I think what you'll see 20, 30 years down the road is the culture will change, and generations will come up that have a larger perspective and are thinking in a different way, just naturally, organically. And then there's a real opening for major political movement, because the fact is we are a very diverse country and we're only becoming more diverse, and we're going to be minority white in 20, 30 years. Nothing's going to stop that. Um, so there's an opportunity to create an opening here, I think, for the future that can have major political effects. And I think part of that is a much wider and deeper conversation in our university life and our educational system and in the culture in general, that can ultimately lead to a kind of spiritual movement, much like the civil rights movement, which obviously did not accomplish all it wanted, but did make big changes in society and brought people together from all walks of life because it had such spiritual depth
Yeah. Yeah,
and power.
and power and an individual power, right? Agency for an individual. Like, they talk about the subversive nature of religious acts, and something Jung talked about. And I'm glad you mentioned like Howard Thurman, because he's specifically somebody that I think about who really made a long-standing religion his own. you know it's like he really sat with the theology, he really sat with the scripture, and created his religion of Jesus, because that's what he found to be the best you can pull out of it and most applicable to his life and others. And I think it's a beautiful expression about how one can find authenticity and individuality through something that seems so conformist. And I think that a lot of people are being lied to on the opposite. And I think that's what you're speaking to too, about the hegemony of the society today, where that makes us feel like religion is actually the rigid structure. Theology is actually the rigidity in our history, and not these totalitarian systems that people are fine to just keep creating and keep finding the way the story ends, and it's normally not good. Normally doesn't end great.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I agree. And I don't blame people. Christianity is the one that's on the major chopping block today, right? There's a
of
lot
course,
of
yeah,
reactions against, and I don't blame people for these
right,
negative reactions. But I do think a recognition that, I mean, Christianity is a huge religion. And honestly, I don't want to be offensive, but it almost seems today that, a lot of people, or even most, maybe even the vast majority, I hope not, people who call themselves Christian are completely against every single thing Jesus said, taught, lived, and died
mm,
for. It doesn't make sense to me. You could literally just open up the gospel and point to anything and start reading it. And a lot of people who call themselves Christian are against it. They're just
mm,
against it. Um, it's pretty obvious from the teachings, which are, first of all, you could never be for guns or any kind of violence and say that you're Christian. Doesn't make any sense.
mm.
But obviously, there's a long history of that. You can't be against having immigrants coming into the. I mean, somebody steals your shirt, give them the one off your back. Don't shoot them. Like, that's
Yeah.
not what Jesus. So I can see why people have these issues, but they should know that in the contemplative traditions, in the mystical traditions, in all of our religious traditions, are absolute gems of practices and knowledge and understanding of a whole process of spiritual transformation that transforms our human condition that we're all born into, and that has selfishness, self-centeredness, ignorance of reality as it is at its very heart, but can be transformed and purified to becoming a more loving, compassionate, wise, justice filled world and person. And we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. These are thousands of years of very committed human beings dedicating their lives to try and figure out, how can I become more loving and compassionate and wise, and then passing down what they learned and their knowledge to future generations. I mean, that's what a contemplative tradition is. Uh, and so we want to utilize that. They're wonderful resources, though they're also usually very patriarchal just because of our past history. So they have limitations. But, there's no such, as soon as you want to be spiritual, as soon as you start putting any kind of framework over it, or actually being serious about your spiritual life, you're moving into religion. You're creating a framework, a way of looking at the world. You're disciplining yourself in certain practices. You're trying to treat others in a certain way. based on those views, and now you're in the religious. So there's no real spiritual life without some kind of religious overlay. It doesn't have to look like a traditional tradition or a
Mm.
dogmatic religion that you have to just believe these certain things. The Buddha said, don't believe what I tell you. Find out for yourself. Try it. Test what I say, like gold in the fire. And so it can look much more like that, and it should look like that. And at their best, our religions, have those traditions that can help us grow like that.
Totally. Yeah. Again, on the personal responsibility piece, it's like, yeah, it's fascinating that so much of this conversation kind of circles around how you have to look for yourself, you have to think for yourself, you have to break out of like a certain mindset and just question it, you know,
Yes.
just question it. That's it. It's
Yeah.
like go find the root and find the bottom and know for yourself, whatever
Yeah.
that is. And I think that's ultimately the core of a spiritual pursuit, you know, um, instead of like a mechanical or a, what would you call it, like a modern conformist expression.
Something just kind of if you there's probably two things that can really go wrong. If you think there's no answer and it's just depressing and hopeless, it's not
Mhm.
a good place, and it's not a place of taking personal responsibility. It may be a place of beginning to take a wonderful place to start taking personal responsibility. And I think the other side, though, is thinking, I know exactly what's true. And all of you need to know it, and all of you need to do what I'm telling you because I know
Right.
what's true, and anyone who disagrees with me is against everything that's good in the world, almost by definition. So those two kind of extremes, which I see a lot of people bouncing back and forth between, are the two places that you probably don't want to be. You want to be
Yeah.
middle in the middle road. And that's the place where you take personal responsibility, you continue to grow, you bring a moral impetus and an ethical depth and a commitment to your own transformation to everything you do. And
Mm.
it's also the place of transforming society and our world at
Right.
large and the systems in it, where the other two extremes are not likely to be very fruitful or effective.
Right. And I also think that there's the, just to bring the point in, is that there's kind of like a collective and there's like the individual in this perspective, and the collective is not going to come save you on your spiritual pursuit, right? um, there's no one that's gonna, it's very rare if you're gonna have some like, wonderful yogi come up and for some reason choose you and be like, come as my apprentice, you know what I mean? And that just doesn't happen. Like, that's not going to happen. um,
Search long enough and commit to the journey, maybe.
but that's the point.
That's the
That's
point.
the point. Yeah, because you won't put yourself in those situations if you're not exploring. You won't
Exactly.
even know to see that person. They'll walk right past you. Wouldn't even be able to identify them as
Yeah.
anything special or different or in a pursuit of any kind of truth. It's
Yeah.
just another background thing, an obstacle almost in the, in the world.
Yeah.
Um, just it's interesting, but so I'm curious, man. Like, you know, spiritual, and we're talking about like a spiritual person, right? Like, what are we talking about? Like, I often try to think of like what makes a spiritual individual. Is it just the awareness of spirit or of God or of other planes? Is it somebody that dabbles in religious like texts here and there? Like, how would you kind of describe a religious, or I'm sorry, a spiritual person in your mind?
Well, I mean, the first thing I would say, certainly from my perspective, is that we're all spiritual people, whether we know it or not, because it's just who we are by the fact of being human and being born into this life. There is not just a capacity for spirituality, but it's actually the ground and the basis of everything we do, whether we know it or not.
Mm.
So, a what you're kind of calling a spiritual person, is not usually sometimes what we might think popularly, which might be a little new agey or someone who's a little wooey or, thinks things out of the ordinary and kind of floats around a bit. I would say what we're talking about here, spiritual maturity, is more, I think, what you're getting at. And
Mm.
that is someone who has, recognized this dimension within us, recognized the potential for human beings to have spiritual transformation, what's called in the Christian tradition divinization or theosis, a kind of process of becoming God, being divinized
Mm.
into God. In the Buddhist context, awakening to the nature of reality, the removal of ignorance or avidya. That's a kind of a basic ignorance that we have where we don't see this dimension of reality. And so we become, it's veiled to our eyes. It's the way the Sufis talk about it. And so we can get lost in this world without recognizing our own depth of personhood and potential for transformation. So
Mm.
someone who has become a mature spiritual being has recognized that dimension and then made some significant process or some significant progress in the process of transformation. And so they actually tend to be very grounded, not always, but they can be very grounded, very practical. But you should discover a sense of, you might discover a kind of sense of ease around them, a sense of love, a sense of acceptance. Um, you may discover that they're able to say things to you, certain moments, certain times that seem to cut through something to the heart of who you are, or a sense that they're seeing you in a deeper way. And we all have such a yearning to be seen. Um,
Sure.
so it's almost like sometimes they're able to acknowledge to us deeper parts of ourselves that we know are there, but we're not always able to convince ourselves or admit to ourselves are actually there. And just that reflection or that mirror allows us to see a deeper part of ourselves through our interactions with them. I don't want to put too many boxes on it, but these are usually some of the gifts and senses. They have a peacefulness with life, even amidst sometimes very difficult situations, and not always. None of us are perfect. That doesn't
Mhm.
exist, at least in the way we think about it. Um, so these are some of the qualities. And you can just imagine a world where this dimension was recognized up front. It was part of the culture, and it didn't have to be put within the particular dogma of a particular tradition, but just recognize that there are many different paths to this process of transformation. And if we were all working on it to some degree, or at least a lot of us were, or at least 10 to 20% of us were, um, all of a sudden you create a very different world with a
Yeah.
very different energy. And because spiritual teaching and spiritual teachers are not really they do give information and they give teachings in this, but their greatest gift is their kind of depth calls to depth. Like they've reached parts of themselves, and in these deeper parts of themselves, see, Howard Thurman articulates this so well. I talk about this in the book. For him, was what he called the root of his being. So his way of doing democratic work, his way of doing decolonial work, his way of doing all this kind of work in the world to transform it was that he didn't go this way, the way of a sociologist or a philosopher or anything, pointing outward at everyone else. He went deep inside himself until he found what he called the root of his being. And at that place, that experience, what he found was that we are completely tangled up with everyone else there.
Mm.
Total interdependence. There's
Mm.
no unique, there's unique people and unique kind of manifestations of it. But in that place, it's a place of emptiness, a place of God's being. We're all there. And he said that the root of everyone else's being is thrown together with his own there. And once he found that place, then he could recognize his own root, his own me-ness, his own being in everyone else. He could smell it, he could see it. And at
Wow.
that point, you can't treat it. You treat everyone the way you want to be treated, the way you should be treated, with such a sensitivity and a love because there's no separation anymore. We're
Yeah.
totally interdependent. And so when you go that way, you connect with everyone. There is no individual and collective because you're all there and everything is present there and everything is affected by everything else. And so, um, I forgot even what our original question was, but I think it's a wonderful illustration of how to go about social work from a contemplative perspective.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it was about like a spiritual person who makes a spiritual person, and you're speaking to the qualities, which I love, by the way. I mean,
Yeah. So it's the
that's a great
let me
definition.
let me just tie a quick end on that.
Yeah.
That's where I was so once he was touching that place in himself, it's like he's not just touching it in himself. He's
Mm,
touching it
right.
in everyone else. And
Right.
so what the spiritual teacher or guide is doing is discovering and becoming more intimate and familiar with the places in themselves, but these are places that we're all connected to. And so when we meet them, it's like we feel that same place being tugged in ourself because we're actually not separate there. So they're not giving us anything we don't have. They're just putting a little awareness and energy on this deep heart space that we're already in. And we want to learn how to also become familiar and with it and gain awareness of it and do the really, really difficult, deep inner work of removing the veils and the self centeredness that is covering it up.
Right.
And that's really mostly all they're doing is finding that place within themselves, and then it's resonating, vibrating within us as well because we're all there, we're all connected.
Man, that's absolutely beautiful. Really appreciate you sharing that. Um, but it rolls into my next question is th- there's the spiritual person that has that available to them, right? And much more, of course. But we'll say that, say, in our society today, without the integration of a spiritual instruction or some sort of spiritual community, I'm sure. I mean, of course, it exists some places, but it's not giant. It's not what it used to be. Um, I'm wondering for the spiritual person that isn't a religious person or would call themselves a religious person, as far as like going through a specific tradition. Um, and I know this is something that's talked about at Charis for being an interspiritual monastery, is that if you remain spiritual and you can see that side of that collective, that like, oneness with all, um, is there ways to get past that inner spiritually, or is that when you kind of got to dig your heels into a like a religion to go deeper, say like Tibetan Buddhism or like Sufism or
Hmm.
even the contemplative Christian ideas? Is that where you kind of got to kick into some of these spiritual technologies that we have?
Um, Let me just answer that in so I would say it doesn't mean that you have to go join a tradition. That's one thing. If you're called to, and a tradition is calling to you, and it's set up, and it feels right, and it feels aligned, and and you feel, yeah, that you should be specifically and exclusively in a particular tradition, you should do it because it will help. Um, but it's not the only way to deepen on a spiritual path. And certainly Charis is a place you can come to explore some of that. As you know, we do that here. But there tend to be a lot of similar teachings across traditions, a lot of similar kinds of practices, though very distinct modes of looking at the world in frameworks and unique practices and understandings. Um, what we do here at Charis that we are finding to be, at least to this point, effective, and some of us have lived lives like this with teachers from different traditions, is that you can definitely grow and mature and deepen and transform on a spiritual path without being embedded in a particular tradition. That does not mean not utilizing the traditions with great
Right.
respect and dignity, because I don't know why you wouldn't. I mean, I wouldn't be trying to teach a path without these are our tools that humanity has passed down for thousands of years with amazing precision and depth of understanding, and of some of the great people who have advanced very, very far in the spiritual path. And so
Mm,
you want the teachings of Jesus and the Buddha and Muhammad and other traditions to help us, and all the, not just them, but the entire thousands, millions of people that have cultivated those teachings and
right,
further refined them over the years. So at Charis, we don't try to do. It's not separate from our religious traditions. We say we're in deep intimacy and partnership with them.
right,
It's just that you don't have to pick one and say, I am this, quote
right.
unquote. And this is all I'm going to be. And it's to the exclusion of everything else. For some people, that might be perfect. And here at Charis, we would totally support it and help you on that journey. But we also recognize it doesn't have to be that way. And that's perhaps where we depart from a lot of what was maybe considered kind of common wisdom in the past, was that, yeah, look around, but then commit to one, because this is all there is, and
Mm,
do that. That was what you heard from a lot of people, and might still hear today a lot in spiritual circles, is like, you're kind of just a dilettante until as if the only possibility is, kind of really identifying fully with a religious tradition and being that. Otherwise, you're not serious about spiritual growth. I would
mm,
completely reject that stance.
right,
One, because it's not true to my own experience. It's not true
right,
to
right.
a number of other people's experience. And, we see ourselves with wonderful people and giving teachings from different perspectives and seeing how helpful that is for people.
Yeah, absolutely. And honestly, I do see Karis as something that is pushing forth like a radical future in the sense of, of course, spiritual futurism, but also just for our society itself, having that openness and acceptance for, individuals just on the pursuit, um, is fascinating. And, there are people like you and people like Nathaniel that, have really took it on themselves, really took that personal responsibility idea, concept, and embodied it and went after it and discovered spiritual, people and questions and thoughts. And there's almost like a personality type or like a specific person that is that kind of go-getter, that can stay personally and individually dedicated to this pursuit. And I think one thing that that is difficult for the person that is spiritual but not religious is the community, right? And I think that's what Karis really brings to the table, you know.
Yeah. I think that's a great insight, Austin. And we see that growing more and more. And I was exactly what I was thinking of when you were talking. There are some certain personality, like we all have different gifts and capacities and uniqueness. And so growing into our own gifts and how they can serve others is what it's all about. You pursue a spiritual journey to serve others better.
Right,
Um, and so that may have been some of our gifts, but then when you're able to create community, after doing that, then it's just like, you don't have to have that kind of personality to do this. Personal responsibility, but that goes in many shapes and forms. But a community is super helpful, because then you're surrounded by people who um, are like-minded, at least to some degree, who are authentically and genuinely committed to a spiritual path, who want to grow together. And one of our great insights has been the only types of community that exist don't have to be ones where we all believe the same thing, where we all share the same worldview, where we all are doing the exact same practices. That doesn't have to be the basis of a spiritual community. And we
right,
can have community where there is diversity in it, all diversity of obviously race and culture and ethnicity and gender, but also religious diversity. And that together forms its own spiritual community. And it's really, really important to the spiritual journey, because then you have people who are at all different stages of their own progress and maturity. You can learn from those who have made a little more progress. You can help those who have made a little less progress or are a little newer to the path. And it can become a healthy, vibrant way of keeping you on the path and providing the support that's needed without forcing us into a particular box that doesn't feel right, or a particular way of looking at things that doesn't feel right. And this is really important too to understand, is that it's a very unique type of community. It's a sangha that helps our spiritual growth. And there are wonderful communities out in the world, but you are not likely to find this kind of support from those
Right.
communities,
Right.
because they're just, there's a depth to spiritual understanding, and there's a way to approach the negative emotions and the frustrations and angers and difficulties of life, which are legion. Um, and if you don't have some contemplative training and depth, and others who are trying to do the same, approach it from that perspective around you, and especially some spiritual guides that have made some significant progress on the path, there just aren't the inner resources and knowledge to approach the human condition and all the normal frustrations and politics and everything else that comes out in every workplace and every community and every family. Um, but they don't have that kind of knowledge and um, inner resources to face those problems in the same way. So you're not
Right.
likely to receive the same kind of support that will help your contemplative and spiritual growth in the communities that you have in the world. Hence, it's really important to find a spiritual community you connect with and be able to grow within.
Absolutely, man. Yeah. And it's true what you said about what it is to be around, like, the qualities of a spiritual person. I know at Charis, I've gotten the just the validation of the path, the validation of experiences, and certain feelings and thoughts you have along the path. Being able to be in dialogue with some folks at Charis, and like you and Natano and other folks about it as well, that really has brought it home in a way that society outside of it makes it seem like it just exists in my mind and nowhere else. That it's like just a kind of my experience, but not for the rest of the world, not for the rest of my life, kind of thing. And we just do what post-industrial society does, and we just like box everything up, and we just say that's my spirituality. It's over here. This is my work mode. That's over here. This is my family mode. That's right here. This is my workout mode and my fun mode. What you know what I mean? Uh,
Yes, yes.
and it's
It
just so
becomes
funny.
it's again, it's like a sacred secular binary, which in most cultures never happened. There was not never a separation like this. But I think it's one of the great mistakes people who think they're spiritual can make. And, it's a stage. We're all beginners at some point, and we're all seekers at some point, before we get really serious and kind of discipline ourselves and commit to some practices. So it can be a good stage, but seeing spirituality as a component of your life is the wrong way to think about it. Spirituality is the basis, the foundation of everything. It's at the heart of all of reality, because ultimately that reality is spiritual and interdependent and mystical. And this is what, every person in every contemplative tradition who has advanced significantly testifies to. I mean, and so that's something from a very scientific, objective mindset. This is what really convinced me of a spiritual path. It wasn't actually meeting a very spiritual person. Um, I started studying a bunch, and then I met very spiritual people. But if you just read human history, I mean, what is true is that in every single human culture, in every time period of human existence, in with crazy different religious frameworks, every single one, there are some people who are talking about a process of transformation, a spiritual path that goes through different stages and sets of experiences and transforms us and culminates in inconceivable expressions of love and compassion and wisdom and heartfulness, uh, way beyond anything we can imagine. And that is literally true in every human culture we've ever seen. So once I saw that, it's like somebody has to explain, what could possibly be the explanation for this other than it's true. And if that
Yeah.
kind of process of transformation is true, then what else are we doing? What's the purpose of anything else?
Oh,
So,
fascinating.
and if you can, and so I think from a, and again, that's why we can have many different perspectives. You harness evidence, we have conversations, you have dialogue, you write books. This is what the academy does so well. Ignoring these perspectives as if there is not mountains of evidence for them
Mm.
is another kind of indictment of the kind of religious fundamentalism that passes as secularism today.
Mm.
You just ignore the evidence rather than try to argue with it, and you don't let people in who want to argue about it. But it is absolutely true that there has been people who have talked about and tried to teach a process of spiritual transformation in every human culture we've ever seen in the most different, diverse conditions we could ever imagine in every single time period, right? Like
That
it's
is
everywhere.
I wish more people knew that fact, that because that is mind-blowing. And how old do you think you were when you read that, came to that realization?
I was a junior in college. Yeah, junior,
Wow.
senior college. I never heard about a spiritual path till then.
Wow. And so that, and I think I remember well, obviously we've talked about the book before, but that kind of recognition of the universality of religious thought in humans is kind of what set you on this journey.
Yeah, it convinced me that the spiritual path, that this, and so however, a process of transformation of the human condition that removes our selfishness, our ignorance, and the key is that ultimately blossoms as amazing capacities for love and compassion and wisdom and justice. Um, if I became convinced, one, that it was true, this is a true potential the human being has, and then my subsequent journeys, that's true on steroids because I met and interacted with many people who were quite advanced in this process and could do extraordinary things, and not just extraordinary psychic abilities and powers, this stuff is out there, but who were loving and peaceful and wise beyond even a good person. Maybe there was something significantly different that you could experience around them. And so then clearly this is true and it's testified to in every culture. So then it was like, what else would I do with my life? Why wouldn't you, commit to it? It's the purpose of life.
Man,
If that's true, then it's clearly the purpose that we're here for. And so everything else then is just secondary
right.
to the process, whether we know it or not, because we're already caught up in it just by being human.
Right. Yeah. And we just have that kind of ignorance you were referring to earlier, that shell over our eyes about that. Were you seeking spirituality at the time? Were you just readings through history? What were you like then?
I had a really good religion professor. So, I mean, I was a big partier and I was kind of crazy. I was a little bit crazy, Austin. Partier. So, but he kind of he invited me into his class as a freshman, and it was like a senior seminar. And I was like, I went to the first day, and then I was like, I don't want to deal with all this work, so I dropped it. But then I went back and I took a class with him on the historical Jesus, my junior year, and he taught Jesus from the perspective of like a wisdom teacher. And we did a lot of the historical Jesus work. It was a time Marcus Borg and Dominic Crossan were really popular, really good stuff. It was really cool. But I came out of that class with a sense of a spiritual journey that I had never even heard of before. I grew up Catholic, went to church every week, went to Catholic grade school, Catholic high school, went to CDC classes, CCC, I can't CCC. Never heard about a spiritual journey or a process of transformation ever. And so I heard about it then, and this really sparked my interest. And then I started reading widely. And the next semester, I did a tutorial with this professor, who ultimately became a very close friend. I went and stayed at his house for a couple weeks to a month every year, at least in Chicago, until he passed. in 2011. So we became very close. Um, and there's a lot of fascinating stories there, but that can go. We can do that another time. I took a tutorial on him with Thomas Merton, and so that was all more spiritual, mystical literature. I started reading widely and recognized this insight that people in all cultures and times had it.
Mm.
Um, we took a trip down to Merton's Monastery during the summer, I think in between my junior and senior year, or maybe just after my senior year. I spent my first day in silence there at Merton's Monastery. Um, and then after graduating in 1999, I went. Ron Miller was my religion professor's name, and Ron and I and a few other students who were at Lake Forest College all went to the Parliament of World's Religions in South Africa in 1999 in Cape Town. And it was there that Brother Wayne Teasdale started hanging out with us a bunch.
Mm.
And I had met Brother Wayne once. He had done a talk with Ron earlier on the Mystic Heart, and Wayne and I began to struck up a real relationship. And he lived in Chicago, and so when we got back to Chicago, I started going down to see him, and he became my first spiritual teacher. Of course, Brother Wayne was the person, a Catholic monk who wore the orange robe of a Hindu sannyasin, who was very close with the Dalai Lama and considered the Dalai Lama a teacher. And Thomas Keating was his real spiritual father, and so was Bede Griffiths, another Catholic monk. And he coined the word interspiritual. So my very first teacher kind of was coining the word interspiritual the year we met. That was the year the Mystic Heart came out.
Man,
And
that's
so
crazy.
then I was kind of, committed and on the path and inherited his teachers. So that's how it happened for me.
That's so wild. Same time that you found him, he was developing inner spirituality or the idea of it.
Yep.
What a synchronistic moment.
Yeah. I
Man,
can
that's wild.
definitely say I've been immersed in the inner spiritual from day one. 'Cause-
Yeah, man. Well, there's two questions I want to ask you just to wrap up. But I mean, we talked a lot about the book and message it, a lot of, thoughts going into it. And you kind of prefaced it with like, these are my opinions and we're just adding kind of to the dialogue that's out there. Um, what do you want the takeaway to be? What do you want somebody to read the book and kind of take away from the book?
So, number one, I would like to see it. Well, two things I'll say at the beginning, and then there's a bit of a visionary piece I wouldn't mind naming. So, first, I would very much like to see it create a larger conversation in society and especially in the academy about what is this sacred secular binary? How are we using it? Understanding where it came from in our history, which is not very hard to understand. We were trying to create some space from Christian authority to be able to think freely. Same
Mm,
as science, right? That's where the secular binary comes from.
mm,
Um, but what does it mean today, where we have this kind of vibrantly religiously pluralistic democracy, lots of different religious persuasions, lots of different spiritual persuasions, a lot of post-colonial and decolonial work on the very word religion, an
mm,
English word. We didn't get to talk about this much, but even the very word religion has been used in a colonial sense. Like there was no word for religion in India or in Japan or in other countries. When we went over there with battleships and took over these countries, we in Japan, it's fascinating. We sent a letter saying we're not trying to change your religion at all, and they were like, "What is this religion? We don't know what this is. We don't." And
mm,
still today, they don't. So the word religion in English is based on Christianity and a very particular version of religion that actually doesn't even look the same in other traditions. And
mm,
so there's colonial, overhangs with it. And there's a lot of work of this that's been done on this and scholarship and in the academy, but no one's
mm,
asked this basic question. Everyone stays super secular. So
mm,
I would like to, and no one has really recognized, it's been pointed out a little bit, but I don't think the depth to which there is a kind of religious fundamentalism going on in the academy that revolves around making social construction the very nature of reality and the only nature of reality. And so I think I would like to see a bigger conversation started around what are we doing here? What is appropriate in a secular university, in a state university, in our educational system? How should we be thinking about these things? What should we be allowing for? What changes should be made? So just a larger conversation on that. Now, second, that's the first point. Second point is I also hope it will give permission um, to many of the people who are in, especially, I think it gets a little more complicated as you move down the educational system. Not that there aren't things that can be done, but, when we're educating at the university level, people are adults. And they should start acting like adults and thinking like adults. And that's the point of it. And we need to be teaching people about character and civic duty and these kinds of things. We're not going to hold together as a country. So I hope that on the second point, it will give people permission who do have a spiritual life, who do have a contemplative perspective, who might not feel totally comfortable with the discourse and the hard constructivism or hard social constructivism that dominates our discourse, to be able to speak up, to see themselves, to have some hope for some change, and be able to bring actually all of themselves into a deeper conversation. This is so important. I mean, especially from a decolonial perspective, think of indigenous traditions. Like, they want to be scholars. They want to participate in the academy, in our professional educational life, professional teaching, in our democracy, in our country. But they can't do it from a purely secular perspective. You're asking them to cut off their consciousness in a way that doesn't make any sense. So, like, a lot of indigenous traditions will say, we don't have religion. It's not this belief or this dogma, but we have
Right.
spirituality. Our whole life is
Mhm.
spiritual. Everything is.
Right.
Everything we do. Like, I can't even experience my consciousness as separate from the land and the trees,
Right.
the spirits and the rivers. And we want to participate in society. We want to participate in the university system. But when we do our thinking and we write our books, you're telling us we have to act like all this stuff that we experience in our entire world is just has to be thrown to the side to conform to this very particular trajectory of, Western history and Christian authority and hardcore secularism and all the rest, right? So there's a
Mm-hmm.
real colonial aspects to this. It's equally true of thought in the East, where they never separated secular and sacred. So, permission for people who hold a deeper view and don't believe social construction is the only thing that exists to be able to come forward with a stronger voice and start creating pockets where deeper conversations can happen. Um, so, those are the first two things that I would like to see from the book. Um, and I don't want to cut off your other question. I have a third kind of visionary
No,
thing.
please. Yeah, I'd love to hear it. Yeah.
The third thing is so I think I think our country, especially our country, is in great need of this. I mentioned before that I think there has to be some kind of sacred center that'll hold us together, right? And I think this was true in the past, despite all, Christianity was assumed as a superior dispensation almost through our whole history until 40 years ago, right? 30 years ago, 20 years ago. And now we're seeing it in the younger generations really be rejected for good reasons. And so, despite all its problems, its racism, its whiteness, its patriarchy, all of this stuff, right? It still held some kind of moral center to the country. And the best way you can see this is, I think you could ask almost anyone. Donald Trump could never have been elected in, say, the
Right.
1980s. Go back to the 1980s, even the 1990s, people would not have stood for his behavior. And I mean, hardcore
Right.
conservatives would not have stood for his behavior. Like, this was complete. And the reason is because there was some kind of religious, spiritual, moral center of decency that needed to be respected. And
Yeah.
as that got torn away, not for bad reasons, nothing has replaced it. And I think a secular discourse about justice and identities is not going to work.
Mm.
Um, it has to be something that has depth. That center can obviously not be Christianity,
Mhm.
but it does need to be a sacred space of depth and have spiritual energy and be able to connect to people in a transformative way to be able to hold us together. I think there's a real question whether it's possible. And I'm not just belittling, I think these secular perspectives are really important, but they're one voice at the table.
Yeah.
And they should not be hegemonic. I have no problem with them and their insights, which I think are really important. Or for people who are humanist and very secular, they should be included, of course, but they should not be hegemonic and shouldn't be forcing everyone else into their world and ways of thinking, because that's we're just going to keep fracturing. So I think there is a huge need in our country, and I think it's super interesting, for what I'll call an interspiritual Nalanda University.
Yeah.
And it turns out this was actually the original idea of Naropa, though it kind of grew apart from it over the years. But, Nalanda University was the biggest university in the world during its existence in India. And it was a place of great learning, great scholarship, where, it was a Buddhist university, but it did not have just Buddhists. There were a lot of non-Buddhists there. People came from all over to study and to dialogue and to debate. Um, but they were all spiritual practitioners. I mean, they were trying to transform and try to experience the deeper nature of reality and become more loving and wise and compassionate and awakened. Um, and so, it was this great, vibrant center of learning with lots of debate with Buddhists and non-Buddhists, and it was the biggest university in the world. So I think we need an interspiritual Nalanda University in this country that would
Mm.
have a wonderful education, great scholarship, great scholars, and deep practitioners. So a kind of marriage almost of scholar practitioners, who are good scholars and teachers and writers and are thinking deeply about the issues of our society, of our democracy, of practices that can help, but are also deep spiritual practitioners. And almost that kind of wedded together with some monastic, uh, some monks and spiritual training and different traditions and Sufi peers and, rabbis who are really contemplative rabbis. And that kind of educational process could be so potent, I think,
Right.
for students, but also we're in such, it's like the depths of our religious traditions, the depths of contemplative traditions, the
Mm.
Christian contemplative tradition, Sufis, the, Hasidic tradition in the old school language of Judaism, the different lineages of Buddhism, of Hinduism, of Taoism, of indigenous traditions, uh, are just getting to know each other at that kind of level. Not the interfaith level of this is what I believe, these are my doctrines, this is what I do. I go to church and I do this. That's good. It's helpful. I think that's one stage, but the edge of this is what is happening in our deepest experiences of reality.
Right.
How are we
Right.
being
Right.
transformed by our traditions? What are our practices? What are we really learning? And so I see this as like we are like the Greeks trying to do astrophysics. We're just
Yeah.
babies in the field. And the way to grow with this is through deeper intimacy among our contemplative traditions.
Right.
So the other thing an interspiritual Nalanda tradition accomplishes, or university, I mean, interspiritual Nalanda University, is providing a space where much more intimacy can happen, where you have very deep practitioners who are also scholars and understand and can teach, and they're forming relationships and they're in intimate dialogue with one another, and they're actually learning and watching each other be transformed and able to spend years and decades in conversation about what do you really mean when you talk about emptiness
Right.
and the merger of emptiness and compassion. What do you really mean about God, and what does it mean to become God and to be divinized and to actually see what, because we're all trying to do the same thing, become more loving, compassionate, wise. to be transformed into these expressions that are beyond thought and language. And so it's only through connection and conversation and real world kind of relationships over decades that we're going to learn more about what's actually going on, especially in the further stages of the spiritual life and contemplative journeys in the different traditions. So I think that's also a really important conversation that could be had. I think younger people and students would eat it up, and would people all over the world would come to be part of it and to see it and want to be educated in that way. And also including science in that, and including the best of the humanities in our social analysis. There's no reason to leave any of it out. But to me, that is a true university education. And we don't see it. Something like that doesn't exist today. And I think we're in great need of it. And actually, Naropa's pretty well positioned to possibly play that kind of role. But it takes real leadership and vision. But I think
Right.
it would be I think it would garner tons of support. I don't think it would be um, looking for people to come attend it. I think,
Man, I wish that was the case. I wish that could happen and that that was the aim and all that. They're having a bit of an identity issue. They need to find a way to maintain a little bit of what Naropa was, but vastly paint over it with like a modern image of like what's required of a university today. But one thing that you know man, I loved your description of all of that, and that's just absolutely something I think we should aim for as a collective in all this. And just in listening to that, I want to give a little space to the comment and then like the idea of the '80s, like Donald Trump not being able to be elected in the '80s, like for sure. Um, and it's interesting this like we're talking about this kind of like ethical backing like substrate that kind of existed. Um, but as we look at history, in the '80s, we still have Ronald Reagan being the kind of hyper real president, being an actor and stuff like that, and him kind of losing his you know wits a bit to not know that he was selling firearms to
yeah,
some terrorist organizations in Contra. Not to mention the war on drugs and the CIA pumping
the
drugs
AIDS
into
crisis, he just
AIDS
ignored,
crisis.
completely
Right.
ignored. That's unfathomable. Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's like, so it's, yeah, it's hard to talk about some of these, like what was the ethic ground when, things like that are going on, right? It's like, the society needed a specific view and it almost upheld an image of like the morality of America for a lot of people, but what was actually happening behind the curtain was like the almost the I don't want to say the beginning, but almost a continuation of the more public stuff that we see today, right? It's like been slowly just kind of eroding, right, to the point of where now we have Donald Trump, you know.
Yeah. I
Um,
I think that's true. I think it's fair. I mean, I don't think Reagan was a great man or a great moral compass. That was not my point. And what I think makes the question so fascinating is that we did, first of all, we were a much, much wider country, still much more patriarchal than we are now. I mean, if people think things are worse now than they were before, like, I don't know what they need to do. You need to read some history. And 50 years ago, Black people couldn't pee next to a white person in the South.
right,
I mean, they were
right,
getting hung from trees. It is not worse than it was before. And
right,
Reagan
right.
was, yeah, I mean, we have racist things from him. I think he did terrible things. But the fact that we could be way more white, way more Christian, all of these things, and Donald Trump would have no chance of getting elected, um,
Mm,
does say something about us that has happened since then. So I don't think
mm,
looking to the
mm.
past is the kind of moral center we want to look for. Uh,
No,
for very good reasons that has been left behind. And, it's just a fact that we're not an overwhelmingly Christian white country anymore. We're not, and
right,
we're not going to be in the future. Um, so, that past is over, and it was obviously had all of these issues, with it. my point was more that there was something there that would have prevented Donald Trump from getting. And I do think Donald Trump is a much worse version than someone like even than Reagan. I do think Reagan, there were all these problematic things, but I don't think he was a completely amoral, jerk. I don't think that was the case. Or George W. Bush, like, I think he made mistakes. I think he, was not super smart. In general, I think he was a good guy, though. You know, we had the whole war in Iraq and a lot of other terrible stuff that I think was people around him and Dick Cheney, and he made bad investments. I don't think he should have ever been president, but I don't think he was a bad guy. Trump is a totalitarian dictator who would be a Hitler figure if he was able to get away with it. There's
Hmm.
no doubt about that.
Hmm.
And he's not even trying to hide behind a veil of acting with decency,
Right.
which even that tells you that people want to see some decency. When that's
Right.
ripped off and nobody cares anymore, it's a scary place because you don't know where it could go. And it seems, so I think we need to find a center that has some sacredness in it. In some real, I mean, I keep saying moral, but a lot, moral can mean the exact opposite things to two different people. So what
Right.
we need is a center that's deep enough and broad enough that it really is about love and respect and integrity and dignity and character and decency and relationship and being able to be in conversation and respect people even when you have different opinions from them. And that's what we do not know how to do today, and we're receiving almost no training in it in our educational system. In fact, the educational system is almost geared to produce the exact kind of politics that we have today, which is,
Absolutely.
it's like we have this hardcore secularism and this kind of, I don't know if it's extreme, but a hardcore discourse that tries to kind of force things on people,
Hmm.
that comes out of that and completely rejects anything religious. And then the worst version of religion that it imagines is actually what becomes abjected and then empowered on the public stage, which is the
Right.
worst form of Christianity you could possibly have, the worst versions of religion. And so now you have two sides with no capacity to be in dialogue with each other, all of whom are also attacking whoever's closest to, I mean, go over here, they're attacking whoever's closest to them rather than each
I
other.
know.
And there's in the middle where the very idea of respecting other people is just thrown out the window as
Right.
a loser or weakness. And so if there isn't a center deep enough to hold I don't think you can hold real diversity unless you have a center that's deep enough to hold it.
Yeah. How could you?
See the sacredness in people and actually allow for difference and not just be looking for conformity. Um, and I don't think we have that today, and we need to rediscover it. And the only thing that center can be is an interspiritual one.
Yeah. And celebrate the difference.
Yeah, that can hold diversity. I don't know if anything else can.
Yeah. That's beautiful, Rory. Yeah. I agree. Yeah. How could you, what container do you have? Right. Or you're just trying to fit everything in the same shape into
Yeah,
the container. There's no ability for, the multiplicity of awareness or culture or spiritual idea or anything. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
It's gone.
yeah.
Um, Well, yeah, dude. My last question really was, is there anything that I didn't ask you that you wanted to answer or you wanted me to ask you? Or is there anything that, I don't want to leave anything on the table?
I don't think so. It's been like 2 hours almost.
I know. I know. I didn't expect to keep you so long, but there's so much I want to ask you too, like getting into, you know, the radical futures question, which is, what do you think keeps us from, what's the biggest obstacle from us having a unified and prosperous future? I kind of edited it a little bit, um, but there's that. There's what role AI and technology plays in the like inner spirituality and the growth of spiritual futurism and stuff like that. But that's a whole other thing. But we can definitely save that for another pod, another couple hours, man. Yeah. Well, thanks for everything, dude. Really appreciate you, Roy.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you too. Thanks so much, Austin.